They called it paradise. Marble corridors glimmered beneath golden lamps, fountains whispered secrets into the night air, and perfumes of jasmine and rose lingered like ghosts in the dark. Yet behind those silken curtains of the Ottoman harem lay a battlefield unlike any other. Here, beauty was a weapon, loyalty was a gamble, and a single whisper could decide whether a woman rose to command an empire or was quietly erased from history. The Sultan's harem was more than a sanctuary of desire. It was an empire within an empire built on intrigue, politics, and blood. Some of these women, once enslaved, nameless, and far from home, became mothers of sultans, advisors of statesmen, and orchestrators of death. They ruled behind the lattice of gold, unseen but unstoppable. This is their story, of forbidden love turned to vengeance, of silken chambers that hid screams at night, of women who learned to wield power in the only way they could through manipulation, wit, and sometimes poison. If you believe history belongs only to kings and conquerors, stay. What you're about to hear will make you question every story you've ever been told about empire, beauty, and control. Before we begin, if you love uncovering the darker corners of history, where truth and legend intertwine, make sure to subscribe to TorturedPast. It helps us continue bringing forgotten voices back to life. Now, step inside the gilded cage and see what power truly costs. The morning light over Istanbul was deceptive. It touched the domes of Topkapi Palace with gold, glimmered off the Bosphorus, and filled the courtyards with warmth. But inside the imperial harem, sunlight was rationed. It slipped through latticed windows and danced upon walls that no woman could leave without permission. The scent of amber and rosewater filled the air, masking a truth that every girl here learned too late. The harem was not a home. It was a gilded cage where beauty bought safety, and silence was survival. She arrived one spring evening, a girl of no more than 16, her wrists marked from the iron of the slave ship. Her name had been Zofia, once a name from a distant village that no one in this world would ever speak again. The eunuchs led her through narrow corridors lined with tiles the color of the sea. She was stripped, bathed, perfumed, and renamed. Now she was Safiye, a name of purity. The irony was lost on no one. Every step she took deeper into the harem felt like walking into a dream she couldn't wake from. Voices hummed in languages she didn't understand: Persian, Arabic, Circassian, Turkish. Girls whispered to one another about the Sultan, about the favorite, about what it meant to be chosen. In their eyes, fear flickered like candlelight. Life in the harem was ruled by rank. At the top sat the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, whose word carried the weight of law. Beneath her were the Khadans, the Sultan's official wives, each commanding her own apartments and servants. Then came the concubines, trained in the arts of music, dance, conversation, and obedience. And below them all were the attendants, those who hoped for a glance, a favor, a destiny beyond servitude. Safiye was assigned to the novice quarters. The walls were painted with faded tulips, and the air smelled faintly of incense and fear. Her instructor, an older woman named Halimi, told her in a soft voice that everything in this place depended on discipline. Do not speak unless asked. Do not look a man in the eye, and if the Sultan calls, you smile, even when you are dying inside. Days turned into weeks. Safiye learned how to walk gracefully, how to pour coffee without a sound, how to bow without breaking eye contact. She learned the history of the dynasty, the stories of sultans who conquered continents, of women who rose and fell with a whisper. Yet nothing terrified her more than the silence of the nights. Behind the latticework of her small chamber, she could hear muffled cries, hurried footsteps, and sometimes the sound of a door closing forever. Rumors spread faster than incense smoke. A concubine who offended the Valide Sultan was found drowned in the palace bath. Another vanished after spilling sherbet on a silk robe meant for the Sultan. The girls whispered that she had been sent to the cold palace, a hidden wing where disgraced women lived out their days forgotten. Safiya began to understand that the harem was not only a school of grace, it was an arena of survival. Yet, amidst the dread, there were moments of strange beauty. Music from the Sultan's chambers would drift through the corridors like a haunting lullaby. The gardens, tended by unseen hands, bloomed in impossible colors. The marble floors were so polished they reflected your face like water. And sometimes, that reflection was all you had to remind you that you were still alive. One evening, Safiye was chosen to serve at a banquet. She carried a tray of sweetmeats through the perfumed air, her steps trembling with both pride and fear. There, seated behind a golden screen, she caught a glimpse of him, the Padishah, the shadow of God on earth. His face was calm, unreadable, but when his gaze lifted for a fleeting second and met hers, Safiya felt her heart stop. It was not love. It was terror disguised as destiny. When the banquet ended, she returned to her chamber and wept. Not from sadness, but from realization. The harem was not just a prison, it was a mirror. Every woman here reflected the Sultan's power back at him. Their beauty, their obedience, their silence, each was a piece of his empire. And those who could not play their part vanished like smoke. Outside, the call to prayer echoed across the city, drifting over domes and minarets. Inside, Safiye whispered her old name to herself, just once, before sleep claimed her. The last thing she saw before darkness was the flicker of a lamp, a small trembling light in an empire that devoured its own. Months passed, though time in the harem had no real shape. The seasons came and went, but inside Topkapi's walls, everything remained perfumed, polished, and still. For the women who lived there, the days were marked not by sunlight, but by favor. One nod from the Sultan, one glance from a steward, one rumor that your name might be spoken in the halls of power. Safiye had learned to hide her fear well. Her eyes had grown calm, her gestures slow and deliberate. She spoke softly, bowed precisely, and smiled only when required. She was becoming what the harem demanded, a creature of control, delicate as glass, yet sharp enough to cut. Her training continued beneath the watch of the Usta Kadınlar, the elder women who had long ago surrendered their youth to the palace. They taught the concubines the arts that pleased a sultan: calligraphy, poetry, music, and the subtle game of conversation. A woman's voice can rule an empire if she knows when to whisper, one of them told her. Safiye repeated that line in her mind for days. At night, she sometimes dreamed of her homeland, a river glimmering in moonlight, her mother's hands braiding her hair. But each morning, the memories faded like mist. The harem demanded forgetting. Even your past could be a danger here. Whispers filled the corridors, rumors of new arrivals, of favorites rising and others falling. The most dangerous of all was jealousy. A single look, a poorly chosen word, could bring ruin. One night, Safiye's closest friend, a Circassian girl named Aylin, failed to return from the Sultan's chambers. The next morning, her bed was stripped bare, her belongings gone. The official word was that she had been sent to another palace. Everyone knew what that meant. The palace eunuchs, silent and watchful, kept order in this kingdom of women. They carried messages, enforced rules, and maintained the illusion of harmony. Their faces betrayed nothing, but even they feared the Valide Sultan. She was the mother of the ruler, the highest woman in the empire, and her word could decide who lived to see another dawn. Safiye saw her once. The Valide passed through the corridor surrounded by attendants, her robes sweeping across the marble like a shadow. Her face was veiled, but her presence was suffocating. Every woman knelt, heads bowed to the floor. Safiya felt a strange shiver run through her. This was power, silent, veiled, absolute. Over time, Safia began to understand that the harem was not separate from the empire. It was the empire. The sultan's decisions were shaped by whispers carried from these chambers. Concubines became mothers of princes. Mothers became Valide sultans. And from behind gilded doors, wars were influenced, treaties were born, and enemies quietly disappeared. One winter night, snow fell over Istanbul. From the harem windows, Safiye watched flakes gather on the palace roofs. The world beyond those walls felt unreachable, almost imagined. Then, in the stillness, a sound broke the calm, a low, stifled cry followed by hurried footsteps. The women froze. Everyone knew what that sound meant. Someone had been found guilty. Later, when the silence returned, an old servant whispered the truth. One of the Sultan's favorites had been accused of plotting against the Valide. She was strangled with a silk cord, her body carried away before dawn. Her name was never spoken again. That night, Safiye couldn't sleep. She stared at the candle flickering beside her bed, its flame trembling like a frightened soul. She thought of how easily a woman could vanish here, erased not by violence but by obedience. The fear did not make her weaker, it made her sharper. She began to watch, to listen, to learn who spoke too much, who smiled too little, who walked too confidently down the wrong hall. For in the harem, knowledge was the only weapon you could wield without spilling blood. Weeks later, the Sultan's gaze returned to her. A summons arrived, a golden seal pressed into wax. Her name had been chosen. The moment every woman dreamed of and dreaded. She was bathed, perfumed, dressed in silks of emerald and gold. Her attendants brushed her hair until it shimmered like dark honey. When the eunuchs came to lead her to the Sultan's private chambers, Safiye felt her knees tremble. The door opened, and the scent of oud and sandalwood filled the air. Inside, the Sultan sat by the window, his face lit by lamplight, the city stretching silent beyond. He turned to her slowly. "Come closer," he said. His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of empire. As Safiye stepped forward, she felt the walls of the harem closing behind her. There was no going back. Whether she rose to glory or vanished like so many before her life now belonged to the man before her. And so began her true test, the first step from servitude into the dangerous realm of power. History remembers her as HurremSultan, the woman who bent an empire with a smile. But long before her name was whispered in fear and admiration across the Ottoman world, she was Roxelana, a slave from the cold plains of Ruthenia. Torn from her village during a Tatar raid, she arrived in Istanbul with her wrists bound, her eyes defiant, and a will that refused to bow. Inside the gilded labyrinth of the harem, she should have vanished among hundreds of others. Yet there was something different about her. The older women saw it in the way she laughed, not timidly, not politely, but boldly, as if daring fate to strike her down. The eunuchs whispered that she was dangerous. The Valide Sultan, ever watchful, noted her name. And one night, when the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent visited the harem, destiny turned its gaze upon her. No one knows exactly what drew him to her. Some said it was her beauty, others her wit. But those who knew the Sultan understood that his heart was not easily moved. Suleiman was a poet as much as a conqueror, a man who weighed every word and gesture. When Roxelana met his eyes for the first time, she did not lower hers. Instead, she smiled. A small, fearless curve of the lips that changed her life forever. The Sultan summoned her again. And again. In the harem, repetition meant significance. Jealous murmurs spread like smoke. "The Ruthenian has bewitched him," they whispered. "She will bring ruin." But what those whispers missed was her mind. Roxelana understood the harem as few others did. She learned its rhythms, its rules, its unspoken codes. She never raised her voice, never revealed anger, When other concubines schemed openly, she waited. When they fought for attention, she studied their mistakes. Patience, she knew, was the sharpest blade. In the private chambers of the Sultan, Roxelana became something no concubine had ever dared to be, his equal in conversation. While others sang songs or offered flattery, she asked questions about his campaigns, his poems, his dreams. She recited lines from Persian verses he loved, her accent wrapping around the words like silk. She made him feel seen not as the Padishah, but as a man. The harem trembled. To love the Sultan was one thing, to change him was another, and Harem, as he renamed her, meaning the joyful one, was changing everything. When she bore him a son, Mustafa's birthright as the eldest prince should have been untouchable. But Hurrem's child shifted the balance of power. The Valide Sultan, Hafsa, watched from her apartments with growing unease. She had seen women rise and fall before, but never one who dared to challenge the sacred hierarchy of the palace. Hurrem's laughter still echoed through the corridors, gentle, melodic, infuriating. To some, it was charm. To others, it was a declaration of war. Then something unprecedented happened. Suleiman broke the ancient Ottoman custom that forbade a sultan from marrying a concubine. He made Harem his legal wife. The harem erupted in disbelief. Never in the empire's history had such a thing occurred. The empire's court poets sang of their love, while the viziers muttered of disaster. Hurrem's transformation from slave to queen was complete. But every rise in the Ottoman court came with shadows. Her elevation created enemies she could not yet see. Behind her smiles, the Valide Sultan's influence waned. The viziers whispered of her sorcery, and her rivals plotted her fall. Still, Harem played her part perfectly. She funded charities, wrote letters to foreign rulers, and appeared beside the Sultan as no woman before her had dared. She was no longer simply the Sultan's consort. She was the empire's pulse, its silent architect. Yet power within Topkapi was never secure. In the shadows, Mahidevran Sultan, mother of Mustafa, the Sultan's firstborn, watched her position crumble. Once the favored consort, she now lived in humiliation, her son's future threatened by the woman from Ruthenia. One evening, after a tense confrontation, Mahidevran struck Harem across the face. The next day, the Valide Sultan summoned Mahidevran in silence. Her punishment was exile from the main palace. From that moment on, everyone knew the truth. HurremSultan had won. But victory in Topkapi came with a price no one escaped for long. As her influence grew, so did the blood in her shadow. The empire's future would soon hinge on a mother's fear, a son's ambition, and a lover's devotion. The golden walls of the harem had seen love before, but never love that would rewrite the empire itself. The marriage of Harem and Suleiman was more than a union of affection. It was a quiet revolution that rippled through every level of the Ottoman world. The empire's laws remained unchanged. Its armies still marched. Its mosques still rose against the skyline. But behind those walls of marble and silence, the axis of power had shifted. In a world where concubines were meant to be replaced, Harem endured. Her chambers, once modest, now shimmered with fabrics brought from Persia and jewels from Venice. Yet her true strength lay not in wealth or ornament, but in understanding the game that governed the harem, and how it extended beyond its golden lattice into the heart of statecraft. Suleiman trusted her completely. In letters, he called her my heart, my companion, my joy. She replied with a devotion that concealed her strategy beneath tenderness. Every word she wrote was poetry, but every line carried purpose. She spoke of loyalty, faith, and fate. But between the verses, she spoke of influence. She began to advise him privately, her counsel shaping his views on diplomacy and religion. When envoys from Venice arrived, they found gifts not only for the Sultan, but for the woman beside him, an acknowledgement that she, too, held the reins of empire. Yet for all her power, Hurrem knew how fragile her position was. The harem's walls whispered, and the whispers were deadly. Mahidevran, though exiled, still had a son, Prince Mustafa. The empire adored him. The soldiers sang his name. The people saw him as the future. And for Hurrem, that made him a threat to everything she had built. No one knows precisely when the fear began to take root in her heart. Some say she was haunted by dreams, visions of her son strangled by silk cords, of her name erased like dust. Others claim her paranoia was fueled by the Valide Sultan's warnings before her death. Power given to a woman is a flame, Hurrem. It warms until it burns. When the Valide passed away, the last restraint on the harem's politics vanished. Hurrem filled the void she left, becoming the de facto queen mother while still alive. She arranged marriages for her allies, secured positions for loyal eunuchs, and placed her sons in favored provinces. Every move was deliberate, every gesture rehearsed. Then came the most infamous letter in Ottoman history. Sent from Hurrem to Suleiman while he was on campaign, it spoke of betrayal, rumors that Mustafa was conspiring with the Janissaries, planning to seize his father's throne. Whether the rumors were true or planted remains a mystery that historians still debate. What is certain is that the seed of suspicion took root in the Sultan's mind. Years passed and tension built like a storm that refused to break. When Suleiman finally summoned Mustafa to his tent in 1553, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Witnesses say the prince entered calmly, bowed before his father, and spoke no word in defense. By the Sultan's command, the executioners entered. The silk cord tightened. The empire's brightest hope was gone. Hurrem was not present that day, but her shadow was. Some say she wept when she heard the news. Others say she smiled knowing her sons were safe. The truth lies somewhere between the two, because even if she had orchestrated it, she would have known the cost. A piece of her humanity died with Mustafa. After his death, Suleiman changed. The poet-warrior became somber, his verses darker, his eyes older. The harem, once filled with laughter and rivalry, grew quiet. Hurrem's influence remained, but it came to her like an echo rather than a triumph. Power had brought her safety, but not peace. In her final years, she turned to faith. She built mosques, charitable kitchens, and schools. The people of Istanbul called her Haseki HurremSultan, the generous queen. But within Topkapi's walls, the servants still whispered of poisonings, plots, and the invisible web she had spun. When she died in 1558, Suleiman buried her beside the great mosque he built for himself, an honor never before given to a woman. And yet, as her tomb closed, so too did the last chapter of their strange, dangerous love. The empire she helped shape would never be the same. For Hurrem had shown every woman who came after her that power could live behind a veil, and that even within the cage, a woman's will could change the course of empires. When the Sultan's mother walked, the palace trembled. Before Hurrem, before the age of love and scandal, the true rulers of Topkapi were not the sultans themselves, but the women who had borne them. The Valide Sultan, Mother Sultan, was the empire's quiet architect, her authority vast and unseen, stretching from the harem's jeweled corridors to the council chambers of the divan. Her son might command armies. She commanded him. The Valide's power was woven from something subtler than decree. It was the invisible thread of loyalty, spun from midwives, tutors, eunuchs, scribes, and concubines who owed their livelihoods to her favor. She never shouted. She never threatened. She didn't need to. In the harem, her word was fate. Her apartment sat above the rest, overlooking the Bosphorus, where ships came and went bearing tribute to the empire. Below her chambers stretched a labyrinth of women, concubines, attendants, and servants, all linked to her by a single truth. Without her blessing, they were nothing. But the Valide's life was no paradise. It was a balancing act between love and cruelty. For every prince she raised, she knew one day her other sons might die by that same child's order. Ottoman succession was merciless. When a sultan ascended the throne, his brothers were often strangled, silk cords drawn tight in the name of stability. The Valide wept in private, but she also gave the command. Imagine the torment of a mother who prayed for her child to become sultan, knowing that victory meant fratricide. This was the curse of the Valide. Oh, among the most formidable of them was Kösem Sultan. Born Anastasia in a small Greek island village, she was captured and brought to Istanbul as a slave. Like Harem before her, she rose through charm and intellect, catching the eye of Sultan Ahmed III. She became his favorite, then his wife, then the mother of princes. When he died, she did not fade into mourning. She ascended into power. As Valide Sultan to multiple sultans, her sons Murad IV and Ibrahim, Kösem, ruled through cunning and restraint. The empire was in chaos. Rebellions brewed, the treasury emptied, and the janissaries grew restless. But behind every decree signed in her sons' names, it was Kösem's hand that guided the pen. Her chambers became a secret court. Viziers sought her counsel before daring to approach the sultan. Ambassadors sent gifts not to the throne, but to her. Her seal appeared on orders of execution. Her whisper could appoint or destroy a governor. And yet, in public, she appeared serene. A figure of maternal virtue, never boasting, never gloating. That was her genius. Still, power in Topkapi was a tide, and every tide eventually turns. When her son Ibrahim became sultan, the empire sighed in unease. Ibrahim was erratic, prone to indulgence and paranoia. The palace whispered that he was unfit, a puppet ruled by his own whims. For years, Kösem held the empire together behind his back, smoothing his disasters, bribing his ministers, shielding the dynasty from collapse. But even she could not control the storm forever. Her grandson Mehmed, barely a boy, was next in line. The court split into factions, those loyal to Kösem and those devoted to the child's mother, Sultan, a young woman with ambition sharp as a blade. It was a dangerous symmetry. Two women, two generations, both claiming to guard the empire's future. One with experience, one with youth. And between them, a throne. Late at night, in the dim flicker of oil lamps, Kösem walked her corridors alone. The mosaics glimmered under her feet, the walls heavy with secrets. She had ruled longer than most sultans, seen more death than any soldier. Yet even now, she could feel the end drawing near. Servants avoided her gaze. Eunuchs whispered in corners. Somewhere deep in the harem, another woman was waiting, watching her, learning her weaknesses. In the silence, the Valide Sultan's heart finally understood what all her predecessors had known. Power borrowed is never truly owned. The palace that had once obeyed her was beginning to shift its loyalty. And in Topkapi, a shift like that was a death sentence written in silk. The night Kösem Sultan died, the palace was too quiet. Even the fountains seemed to hold their breath. She had lived long enough to see the empire's pulse through 3 reigns, had watched sons she loved turn into tyrants, had buried grandsons with trembling hands. Yet it was not time or sorrow that would end her reign. It was betrayal, the familiar kind that comes only from within. Sultan, the young mother of Sultan Mehmed IV, had been patient. She had studied Kösem's methods, the web of servants, the network of spies, the way she moved power like a chessboard. But patience in Topkapi was never endless. When whispers reached her that Kösem planned to have her grandson replaced with another boy who might be easier to control, Turhan acted before rumor became truth. It was said Kösem slept lightly, a habit born from years of danger. Yet that night, her guards were dismissed under false orders. The eunuchs stationed at her door were replaced by men who did not serve her. She woke to the sound of footsteps in the dark, a sound too soft to be soldiers, too careful to be servants. When the shadows entered her chamber, Kösem reached for the small dagger she kept hidden beneath her pillow. She managed to wound one man, but there were too many. The silken bowstring was drawn tight, the empire's most powerful woman silenced without trial or farewell. By morning, the corridors of Topkapi were alive with rumor. Some said she had been poisoned. Others swore her ghost was seen walking the harem, her veil soaked in blood. The truth was simpler and crueler. The Valide Sultan had fallen to the very machine she had mastered. Sultan emerged as the new Valide, young, shrewd, and resolute, yet she would spend her life haunted by the woman she had killed. For even in death, Kösem's legend grew. The people of Istanbul called her Kösem the Great, whispering prayers at her tomb as if to appease her restless spirit. From that moment, the role of the Valide Sultan changed forever. The empire had entered what historians would later call the Sultanate of Women, a century where queens and mothers ruled from behind the veil. They were not elected, not crowned, yet their decisions shaped the fate of millions. But within the harem, power was a poison that no woman could drink without consequence. Each Valide that followed, Turhan, Hatice, Besmi Alem, played her part in the same endless cycle: rise, rule, fall. They built mosques, endowed schools, fed the poor, all while pulling invisible strings over viziers and pashas. Yet the same walls that echoed with their orders also heard their tears. For every triumph came a cost. A son executed, a husband lost, a name dragged through the mud of rumor. Sultan's reign, though victorious, was marked by loneliness. Her son Mehmed IV adored her, but feared her power. The court grew wary, the viziers restless. When she finally ordered the construction of the Yeni Cami, the great mosque of Istanbul, it was less an act of devotion than repentance. The grand dome rose from the city skyline like a confession carved in stone. In the quiet of her final years, Turhan often sat by the windows of her private quarters, staring out toward the Bosphorus. She had everything: wealth, reverence, a dynasty secured. Yet she often whispered to her attendants, "Power is a sea without shore." Perhaps she had learned what Kösem knew too late, that no woman truly ruled in Topkapi. They merely survived it. As the decades passed, the empire began to forget their faces but not their influence. The Valide Sultans had become both revered and feared figures, half myth and half memory. Chroniclers reduced their lives to footnotes, but within the palace their presence remained. Every new concubine who entered those halls was taught their stories, not as history, but as warning. The Valide's apartment still stood high above the rest, their windows glinting in the sun. Yet those who looked up at them now saw something different. Not power, but ghosts. The empire had been built by men who conquered with swords, but it had been held together, quietly and relentlessly, by women who ruled with whispers. And in those whispers, the Ottoman dynasty learned its cruelest truth, that the greatest danger to a throne was not the enemy at its gates, but the mother behind its curtain. There is no silence heavier than the silence of a locked chamber in Topkapi Palace. Behind those golden doors, the Ottoman princes, the Shahzadis, lived in quiet captivity, their fate written in the veins of their blood. They were sons of sultans, born to rule, yet most would never see the throne. The empire that had once rewarded conquest now feared ambition. It was called the Kafes, the cage. In earlier centuries, Ottoman succession was a brutal affair. When a new sultan rose, his brothers were strangled with silk cords, a mercy meant to prevent civil war. The law of fratricide was not cruelty for its own sake. It was order disguised as horror. Yet with time, the bloodshed grew unbearable even to those who wielded it. The dynasty could not continue drowning itself in its own veins. So, the sultans built the cage, a gilded prison for princes too dangerous to kill, but too valuable to set free. The Kafes was not a dungeon. It was an ornate labyrinth of chambers filled with luxury and emptiness. Fine carpets, silver trays, polished marble, and silence. The princes were kept under watch, guarded by eunuchs and forbidden from the outside world. No visitors, no sunlight, no freedom. Their only crime was birth. Some grew old there, their hair turning white while their brothers ruled and died. Others went mad, their minds unraveling in the endless quiet. There were stories, rumors whispered by servants, of princes who spoke to birds through the window grills, or carved poems into the walls to mark the passage of forgotten years. The cage became not just a prison, but a monument to fear itself. The first prince to endure it was Mustafa, the brother of Sultan Ahmed I. He was spared when Ahmed died young, and for a brief moment, freedom returned. But his mind had already fractured. The years in isolation had left him paranoid, erratic, and easily manipulated. When he became Sultan Mustafa I, he released the birds from their cages and wandered the palace talking to shadows, convinced that the walls could hear his thoughts. Within a year, he was deposed. Proof to the court that too much mercy could destroy a dynasty as surely as too much blood. The next generations took heed. Princes were kept in the cage from childhood for their safety, though everyone knew it was really for the sultan's peace of mind. Imagine the sound of the palace at dawn, the muezzin's call echoing across the courtyards, the flutter of pigeons on marble, and beneath it all, the soft click of a lock turning somewhere deep inside the harem. Another day began, and another prince woke to nothing. To the outside world, the Ottoman Empire still gleamed, its armies vast, its cities magnificent, its scholars and artisans unmatched. But behind that grandeur lay a dynasty slowly poisoning itself with paranoia. The harem, once a symbol of royal majesty, had become a chamber of ghosts. The princes within it were living relics of a past that no longer knew what to do with them. Some historians would later call the cage a political innovation, a humane alternative to murder. But to the men who lived it, it was a slow execution stretched across a lifetime. Each breath was a reminder that the empire's survival demanded their stillness. One chronicler wrote of a prince who, after 30 years in the cage, was finally crowned sultan. When he emerged, blinking in the daylight, he asked the viziers, "Do the streets still exist?" His hands shook as he touched the air, as if the world itself were unreal. He reigned only a short while before retreating into silence again, a ruler who had forgotten how to live outside his cell. The Ottoman dynasty, so obsessed with preserving its bloodline, had built a prison for its own heart. Outside, the empire's enemies gathered, Persians, Venetians, Russians, while within, the princes faded into shadows. And as the century turned, one question began to haunt the palace halls like a ghost. If the sultans had killed their brothers to preserve the empire, and caged their sons to preserve their thrones, what, in the end, had they truly preserved? There were times when the cries of the princes could be heard through the walls of Topkapi, soft, stifled, and quickly silenced. The guards would say nothing, for silence was its own law in the palace. But those who served in the cafes carried the sound with them for life, as though a piece of the empire's conscience had been trapped within that echo. To the outside world, the Ottoman court was still a theater of splendor. Processions wound through Istanbul's streets with banners, drums, and gold-laced horses. The Sultan appeared at the balcony, his robe a shimmer of silk, his turban towering like a crown of clouds. Yet the people did not know that behind that perfect image stood a man raised in solitude, a ruler whose only companions had been silence and suspicion. Many of these sultans had never seen war, never felt the earth shake beneath the march of their own armies. Their first real test of power began not on the battlefield, but at a writing desk surrounded by advisors who spoke in riddles of loyalty and treason. When such a man ruled, his word was both absolute and fragile. He could command thousands, yet fear the whisper of one eunuch. Sultan Ibrahim, later called Ibrahim the Mad, was one such man. Born in captivity, he spent his youth locked away, waiting for the day he might be strangled like his brothers. When the news came that his sibling, Sultan Murad IV, had died, Ibrahim refused to leave his chamber. He thought it was a trick. Only after the Grand Vizier swore on the Kur, and that he was truly Sultan, did Ibrahim step into the sunlight, shaking, pale, and broken. But freedom did not heal him. It only magnified the cracks. His reign became a spectacle of excess and instability. He filled the harem with hundreds of women, showering them with jewels while the treasury groaned under the weight of debt. He grew obsessed with scents, ordering entire ships of musk and ambergris. He had the palace walls coated with perfume oils so that every breeze would remind him he was alive. Yet even that could not wash away the stench of fear. Those who watched him saw the toll of the cage made flesh. The madness was not born from cruelty, but from the unnatural quiet of too many years spent in confinement. It was the sound of thoughts left to rot in solitude. In time, the court had enough. Ibrahim's excesses threatened the empire itself. The same walls that had once kept him captive now closed in again. In 1648, the Janissaries stormed the palace. The decree was short. The Sultan has lost his reason. The empire must be preserved. He was taken to the very room where so many princes had died before him. The silken cord did its work swiftly, and once again, the empire sighed in relief, calling it justice while pretending it was mercy. But the pattern was clear. The more the Ottomans feared their own blood, the weaker their bloodline became. The cage that had been built to protect the throne had begun to poison it from within. And still, it continued. Princes were born, taken from their mothers, and confined. Each generation inherited the same ritual of waiting, for a brother's death, for a vizier's favor, for a door that might never open. There were rare moments of tenderness. Some concubines, the mothers of these princes, managed to send secret letters or small gifts through trusted servants. A prayer bead, a folded verse of the Quran, a lock of hair tied in silk. These fragile offerings were all that remained of human warmth in a place where love was forbidden to grow. One attendant later recalled a prince who spent his years copying verses of Persian poetry, believing that words could survive where he could not. "If I cannot live as a man," he wrote, "let me live as a memory." In many ways he did. When at last the empire began to crumble under wars, rebellions, and the slow decay of power, the ghosts of the Kafes seemed to whisper through the cracks of its foundations. For how could a dynasty that feared its own sons ever trust its people? How could an empire that silenced princes ever speak truth to itself? The Ottomans had conquered lands across 3 continents, yet the greatest territory they lost was within, the human soul behind the throne. And so, as the centuries turned, the legend of the harem and the cage intertwined. A tale of beauty gilded over suffering, of splendor built on silence. The world saw marble, gold, and power, but inside those walls, the princes waited, nameless and forgotten, like caged stars that no longer burned. By the dawn of the 18th century, the empire that once commanded continents had grown weary. The cannons still thundered, the banners still waved, but the spirit that had driven its rise now flickered like a dying flame. Inside the walls of Topkapi Palace, that change was felt not through battle, but through silence, the kind that follows centuries of blood and ambition. The harem, once the secret heart of Ottoman power, now stood like a monument to a vanished age. The eunuchs walked its marble corridors in slow ritual, their sandals whispering against the cold stone. The laughter of concubines, once bright and dangerous, had softened to murmurs of prayer and gossip. Even the fountains seemed to mourn. Power had moved elsewhere, to viziers, to pashas, to foreign courts, but the echoes of those who had ruled from behind the veil still haunted the palace. Some said their spirits never left. Servants whispered of Kösem's shadow gliding past the Valide's window, of Hafsa Sultan's perfume lingering in the dawn air, of Turhan's voice carried faintly by the Bosphorus breeze. Whether ghosts or memory, no one could say. But every woman who entered the harem still felt their presence, as if warned by the past itself. This is no home for love, only survival. Beyond the palace walls, the empire was changing. The Europeans, once awed by Ottoman might, now crept closer with cunning and trade. The wars were costly, the treasury bled. In the great markets of Istanbul, silks arrived from Venice, rifles from Vienna, and rumors from everywhere. The empire that had feared its sons now feared its own decline. But in the quiet corners of the harem, the women still ruled, no longer over sultans, but over legacy. They became the keepers of memory, the silent chroniclers of a dynasty that had forgotten how to feel. The last great Valide sultans turned their wealth toward faith and charity, raising mosques, fountains, and schools across the empire. Each stone they placed seemed to whisper repentance for the sins of power. One of them, Kösem Sultan, the mother of Abdülmecid I, would later be called the saintly Valide. She walked barefoot through her own courtyards, spoke kindly to servants, and forbade cruelty in her name. Yet even she could not escape the shadow of those who came before. She ruled softly, but she ruled, and in the Ottoman world, even kindness was a kind of control. Outside, the empire stumbled toward modernity. Steamships appeared on the Golden Horn, and telegraphs hummed through distant provinces. The sultans adopted Western fashions, built European-style palaces, and posed for portraits in frock coats instead of robes. But for all its reforms, the empire could not reform its heart. Topkapi remained frozen in its own history, a labyrinth of beauty and sorrow, its walls too thick to forget. There is a story told by an old palace guard, long after the last sultan had fled into exile. He said that one night, walking the deserted corridors of the harem, he heard the faint sound of silk rustling. When he turned, he saw a figure in a jeweled veil standing by the fountain. She looked at him, smiled once, and vanished into the darkness. He swore her eyes were filled with both pride and grief, the eyes of someone who had loved an empire enough to destroy it. The Ottoman dynasty would fall not with a scream, but with a sigh. When the Republic was born in 1923, the palaces were emptied, their treasures catalogued, their rooms sealed. The harems became museums, the cages became exhibits, the ghosts became history. And yet, if you walk through Topkapi today, the air still carries a kind of silence that feels alive. The scent of rosewater lingers faintly. The golden screens still glimmer as the sunlight moves across them, as if searching for the women who once ruled through them. They are gone, but their stories remain, woven into the marble, the silk, the stone. For power fades, empires crumble, but memory endures. Time moved on, but the shadows of the harem did not. They lingered in the corners of Topkapi, in the faint sound of wind that slipped between the latticed windows, in the scent of attar that still clung to its stones. For nearly 500 years, the women of the Ottoman harem had shaped the empire's destiny from behind silk curtains. When their voices finally fell silent, the empire itself began to fade, as though it had lost its hidden pulse. By the end of the 19th century, the Ottomans were no longer feared. They were pitied. The sick man of Europe, the diplomats called them. The palaces grew larger, more lavish, as if the dynasty believed that marble could cover decay. Dolmabahce Palace rose by the Bosphorus, a glittering monument of chandeliers and mirrors. But inside, the ghosts followed. The same rituals, the same hierarchy, the same veiled women whispering in rooms heavy with perfume and regret. Sultan Abdulaziz, then Abdulhamid II, tried to reclaim the empire's old strength. They spoke of modernization, of schools and railways, of saving the Ottoman soul. But Abdulhamid's reign, in particular, revived the old fear of betrayal. He trusted no one, not his ministers, not his guards, not even his family. He reinstated the secrecy of the harem, the isolation of his sons, the quiet control of his mother and sisters. He built a new kind of cage, not of stone this time, but of surveillance and suspicion. And yet, even in its final century, the harem remained what it had always been, a reflection of power itself. The women within its walls could be prisoners or queens, victims or architects of their own fate. Their beauty was a currency, their silence, a weapon, their love, often their undoing. Historians like to separate fact from myth, but in the Ottoman harem, truth was always half legend. Were there truly poisonings, strangled rivals, secret births, and whispered curses? Perhaps. But even the rumors spoke a kind of truth, that power in its purest form rarely shows its face in daylight. It hides in the dark, softens its voice, and learns to smile while it kills. When the final Sultan, Mehmed VI, left Istanbul in 1922, he did not look back. The palace guards stood motionless as the last ruler of the House of Osman boarded a British ship and sailed into exile. The sound of his departure echoed across the Bosphorus like the end of a prayer. In Topkapi, the doors of the harem closed for the last time. Inside, the rooms remained exactly as they had been, the marble baths still glistening, the silk cushions untouched, the mirrors reflecting only the emptiness. For the first time in centuries, there were no footsteps, no laughter, no whispered intrigues. Only silence, thick and eternal. When the new republic turned the palace into a museum, historians walked through those same corridors with notebooks in hand, trying to make sense of what had been. They catalogued the jewels, the robes, the furniture, but they could not catalogue the lives that had passed through them. How could one measure the weight of centuries of love, fear, and sacrifice? How could one explain what it meant to live and die unseen? Even now, visitors pause in the hall of the Valide Sultan, staring at the carved wooden screens that once hid the women from the world. They speak softly without knowing why, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Sultan's harem, not the scandal or the grandeur, but the silence, the kind that tells you power was never only in the sword, or the crown, or the throne. It was in the whispers, in the decisions made between mother and son, in the tears shed behind curtains. The harem was not a single story. It was hundreds of women who loved and lost, who ruled and rebelled, who lived behind veils but shaped an empire without ever stepping into the sun. Some were cruel, some were kind, all were human, and in that humanity, in their hunger for survival, their grief, their cunning, and their tenderness, the true empire endured. Not the one drawn on maps, but the one etched in memory. So when you walk the marble halls of Topkapi and feel that quiet pressing against your chest, know this. You are standing in the heart of an empire that no longer exists, but still breathes through the echoes of those who dared to rule it from the shadows. The Sultan's harem was never just a prison, nor a paradise. It was both. It was power and poison, love and fear, a kingdom of whispers that once ruled the world. And though the empire is gone, the women who shaped it remain, unseen, unheard, but never forgotten. If this story moved you, remember, the past lives only as long as we keep its voices alive. Subscribe so that their stories are never silenced again.